In early 1904, tensions escalated between the German Empire and the Herero people of southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, leading to one of the darkest episodes of colonial violence in history. The Herero, under the leadership of Samuel Maherero, had risen in rebellion against German rule, and the empire responded with overwhelming military force. The conflict that followed would lead to the near extermination of the Herero people in what is now recognized as one of the first genocides of the 20th century. This is a story of resistance, survival, and the devastating consequences of colonial oppression. In the late summer of 1484, two ships quietly slipped out of Lisbon harbor, embarking on a journey that would push the boundaries of European exploration. These were the caravels of Diogo Kell, an explorer tasked by King João II of Portugal to venture further south along the African coast than any European had ever gone before. Following in the footsteps of his great-uncle, Henry the Navigator, King João was determined to expand Portugal's exploration efforts and find a sea route to India and China through Africa. On his earlier expedition in 1482, Diogo Cao had discovered the Congo but had failed to find a way around the continent. This time he set out with renewed determination. His ships sailed along the lush shores of West Africa, passing the lagoons of the Niger River and the mouth of the Congo. As they continued east, they explored the coast of what is now Angola, finding natural harbors that would later become vital centers in Portugal's growing slave empire. As they sailed further south, the landscape changed dramatically. The vibrant green shores gave way to the barren, desolate stretch of the Namib Desert. The land before them was unlike anything they had ever seen, an imposing desert stretching 1,000 miles along the coast. It was here, in this remote and unforgiving landscape, that they became the first Europeans to set foot in what is now Namibia. Before stepping ashore, they carefully prepared one of 3 stone padros they had brought from Lisbon. These stone markers, inscribed with the Portuguese coat of arms and a dated inscription, were used to claim the land for the King of Portugal. Despite this formal claim, the Portuguese never established control over the Namib. The harsh environment and the lack of immediate resources discouraged them from returning to explore or establish settlements in the region. Cao's padrone stood undisturbed for over 4 centuries, until 1893, when it was uprooted by a new European power that would go on to dominate the Namib for the next 3 decades. The earliest known inhabitants of the Namib region were the San people, often called the Bushmen. Evidence of their ancient presence is found in the remarkable rock paintings and engravings scattered across the mountains and caves of modern-day Namibia. Around the 17th century, a new wave of migrants arrived, Bantu-speaking pastoralists who had journeyed southward with their cattle seeking new pastures. One group, known as the Herero, pushed further south, settling on the Central Plateau, a region known for its rich grasses. Having no centralized authority or king, they were governed by local chiefs whose leadership was passed down through the maternal line. By the end of the 18th century, the Hereros had established themselves as the dominant power on the Central Plateau, having a population of about 30,000 to 40,000 people. In the early 19th century, a wave of African invaders moved up slowly from the Cape in the south into the Namib, bringing with them trade, new ways of life, and methods of warfare. They were the Nama, a mixed-race people. Often the product of unions between Dutch colonial settlers and the indigenous Khoisan people, they had developed a resilient and mixed culture, adopting some Dutch customs while retaining their Khoisan traditions. Their assimilation of Dutch tools, particularly the gun and horse, made them formidable warriors. In the late 19th century, Germany, having newly unified as a major European power, began to extend its reach beyond its European borders. German traders and merchants ventured into global markets, staking claims in various regions. However, despite this growing influence, Germany had no formal colonies at the beginning of the 1880s. This situation changed dramatically within a year, leading to the establishment of one of the largest colonial empires in Africa. The catalyst for this transformation was an event on April 10th, 1883, when a German ship docked in Ngro-Pequena, a remote bay on the southwestern coast of Africa. On board the ship was a man by the name of Heinrich Vogelsang. He was sent by a German merchant to the Namib to establish a trading post and lay the groundwork for a German colony. His journey took him 120 miles inland to the settlement of Bethany, home to the Bethany Nama clan, led by Captain Joseph Fredericks. With the assistance of a German missionary acting as interpreter, Vogelsang negotiated a fraudulent treaty with Fredericks, ceding Ngro-Pequena and a 5-mile radius around it in exchange for 200 rifles and 100 pounds, around 15,000 pounds today. On May 12, 1883, the German flag was raised over the land, marking the beginning of Germany's formal claim to the territory, and setting the stage for a larger colonial ambition. Subsequently, the Berlin Conference of 1884 recognized Germany's claims in the Namib, leading to the establishment of German Southwest Africa, which was overseen by an imperial commissioner called Dr. Heinrich Goering. As imperial commissioner, Goering set out to extend German influence in Southwest Africa. Following Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's orders, he was tasked with securing protection treaties that appeared as mutual alliances, but were intended to quietly give Germany control over the region's resources and territory without direct conflict. By mid-September 1885, Goering and his small team journeyed from Walvis Bay to the Herero capital, Okahanja, reaching it on October 3rd. There they met Chief Maharero Kamoha, who at the time was embroiled in a land dispute with a powerful Nama clan called the Witbooi Nama, led by Captain Hendrik Witbooi. Despite initial hesitation, Kamoha eventually agreed to sign the protection treaty. However, this treaty had turned Germany into a de facto enemy of the Witbooi Nama, making any future alliances with them or other Nama clans unlikely. Captain Hendrik Witbooi, a remarkable leader, would prove to be one of the most resilient opponents of German colonial rule. As the conflict between the Herero and Nama escalated, Goering and his men were reduced to spectators, unable to influence the outcome. Witboi's fighters repeatedly raided Herero settlements, exposing the futility of the German-Herero alliance. As a result, in October 1888, Chief Kamoha annulled the protection treaty and expelled Goering and all Germans from Herero lands. Following this, Bismarck sent a small force under veteran commander Kurt von Francois to strengthen Germany's hold on the protectorate. Von Francois had a single mission to expand German control over the region through force. His orders were to establish a military presence that would force the Herero and Nama to submit to German authority. With limited resources, he deliberately provoked the Herero by placing his fort on their main trade route, seizing their supplies in the process. He aimed to trigger a conflict that would force Berlin to send reinforcements, knowing a massacre of German soldiers would be politically unacceptable for Bismarck. By the end of 1889, von Francois' gamble paid off. Bismarck reluctantly dispatched 41 additional troops to the region. Meanwhile, the Herero gathered at Okahanja to decide whether to attack the German fort. Samuel Maharero, the son of the aging Chief Kamoha, was a rising figure in Herero leadership and favored attacking the Germans. But Kamoha viewed the Germans as a lesser threat and chose to focus on the ongoing conflict with the Witbooi Nama. Unfortunately, Kamoha died the following year and the leadership passed to his son Samuel Maharero, who quickly faced challenges from both internal factions and the relentless Witbooi Nama. Sensing an opportunity, Kurt von Francois relocated the German military headquarters to Windhoek, a fertile valley strategically positioned between Herero and Nama territories. This move provoked both peoples as their lands were now occupied by outsiders as a result. Hendrik Witbooi, leader of the Witbooi Nama, grew increasingly alarmed by the Germans' expanding influence and sent numerous letters to African chiefs across the region, warning them against signing protection treaties. He urged Samuel Maharero and other leaders to resist the Europeans and unite against the common threat. However, Witboy's call for unity was largely ignored, as most chiefs remained focused on local rivalries, failing to grasp the long-term danger posed by German colonization. The tensions escalated further in 1893, when von Francois, frustrated by his inability to fully subdue the Nama, launched a surprise attack on Witboy's encampment at Horncrans under the cover of darkness. German troops stormed the settlement, killing indiscriminately. Though the target had been Witboy's fighters, the German soldiers slaughtered women, children, and the elderly as they slept, sparing no one in their path. Undeterred by this horrible incident, Witboy regrouped his forces and carried out successful guerrilla attacks against the Germans. After several humiliating defeats, Berlin soon realized the severity of the conflict, and by late 1893, von Francois was relieved of his duties and replaced with Commander Theodor Leutwein. Leutwein, both a diplomat and soldier, aimed to maintain stability through a mix of military power and strategic treaties. While exploitative, his agreements were more lenient than typical colonial pacts. Instead of seizing vast lands, Leutwein sought to tie local tribes to German economic, military, and cultural interests, believing that long-term stability was more valuable than immediate conquest. When it came to Hendrik Witboy, Leutwein opted for diplomacy over immediate conflict. He spent months exchanging respectful letters, urging Witboy to accept German protection. However, when this diplomacy failed, Leutwein reluctantly launched an assault on the Nama stronghold in August 1894 and forced Witboy to agree to a peace treaty on September 9, 1894. Leutwein's success in ending the conflict and bringing about relative peace in the colony was met with criticism from German colonialists. Many were disappointed that Witboy had not been crushed and viewed the treaty terms as being too lenient. Also, Samuel Maharero and Hendrik Witboy had become significantly wealthy through this colonial process, leading to increased racial tensions in the colony, especially in Windhoek. White settlers and soldiers, notably the Schutztruppe, the German colonial military force, displayed contempt for the indigenous population, committing widespread abuse, beatings, and murders. One incident involved Lieutenant Walter Jobst, a Schutztruppe officer who provoked a conflict with the Bondelswarts Nama clan, leading to the death of their chief. In retaliation, the Bondelswarts killed Jobst and 2 German soldiers. Governor Leutwein responded publicly by declaring war on the Bondelswarts and led a Schutztruppe force on a 500-mile march to crush the rebellion. He left the northern Herero territory in the hands of Lieutenant Ralph Zern, a young and aggressive Schutztruppe officer. This decision would later turn out to be unwise. At Okahanja, the residence of Chief Samuel Maharero, tensions between the Herero and the German settlers had been rising for years, fueled by land disputes and increasing German encroachment on Herero territory. However, these tensions escalated dramatically on the morning of January 12, 1904. The town was unusually quiet. Inside a fortress, around 36 German soldiers and settlers nervously watched over their homes and shops, rifles in hand. 2 days earlier, a local Boer trader had informed Lieutenant Ralph Zern that he had passed a group of about 300 armed Herero men on their way to Okahanja. This news sparked fear among the Germans, who interpreted the Herero movement as a prelude to an uprising without taking time to assess the situation. Zern ordered the German settlers to evacuate their homes and take shelter in the fortress. For 2 tense days, soldiers and settlers watched the town, expecting an attack that never came. Then, on January 12th, 2 senior settlers volunteered to investigate. What they saw only deepened their fear. Around 100 Herero men were saddling their horses. Convinced that this was preparation for an attack, the men rushed back to the fort, warning Zern of the imminent danger. Without verifying the facts, Zern sent a telegram to the Colonial Department in Berlin, claiming that an uprising had already begun. Soon after, shots rang out from the fortress into the streets of Okahanja. In response, the Herero laid siege to the fortress and attacked the German quarter, raiding homes and shops. killing 2 German couples and tearing up the railway tracks to prevent reinforcements from arriving from Windhoek. The violence had begun, but it was based on a misunderstanding. The Herero men that the settlers had seen were not preparing for war. They were representatives of a northern Herero clan that had come to Okahanja seeking the arbitration of Chief Samuel Maherero in an inheritance dispute. Moreover, Samuel Maherero himself was not even in Okahanja that morning. This sudden eruption of violence was the culmination of years of growing resentment among the Herero. Just weeks earlier, in December 1903, Lieutenant Zern had summoned Herero leaders to a meeting at the German fort. At the meeting, he demanded that the Herero sign a treaty transferring large portions of their ancestral land to the Germans when the chiefs refused. He forged their signatures and declared that the boundaries of Herero land had been redrawn. This act of treachery enraged the Herero, adding to a long list of grievances against the German settlers and their government by January 1904. Zern had become a figure of hatred among the Herero, and his reckless actions on that fateful day pushed the region into open conflict. The violence that erupted in Okahanja on January 12th quickly spread across the region. Armed with clubs, knives, and guns, the Herero attacked German farms and isolated homesteads throughout the Central Plateau. Settlers were killed in their beds, sometimes by their own Herero servants. Despite the sudden outbreak of violence, Samuel Maherero, concluding that war with the Germans was inevitable, sought to impose some order on the conflict. His directives were clear. Women, children, and non-Germans were not to be harmed. This order was largely respected throughout the conflict. In contrast, the German settlers and the colonial army responded to the Herero uprising with brutal force. Herero workers were arrested and imprisoned, while isolated Herero communities that had not participated in the rebellion were attacked indiscriminately. As news of the violence reached Berlin, the German press and nationalist groups seized on the uprising to promote their colonial agenda. The Herero were portrayed as savage and brutal, their rebellion framed as an attack on civilization. The German government, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, saw the uprising as an opportunity to demonstrate the might of the German Empire. In February 1904, with the support of nationalist and pro-colonial societies, Wilhelm ordered a large-scale military intervention and dispatched the largest colonial army Germany had ever assembled to Southwest Africa. Lieutenant Zern, the man whose rash actions had sparked the violence, was quietly relieved of his command in June and sent back to Germany. As a final insult to the Herero people, he took with him a Herero skull he had looted from a grave in Okahanja. The race war, once commenced, can only be ended by annihilation or the complete enslavement of one party. When Governor Lutwine learned of the Herero uprising, he sought a diplomatic solution, given his decade-long relationship with Samuel Maherero. However, Kaiser Wilhelm dismissed this idea and commanded Lutwine to lead about 800 soldiers into battle against the Herero in April 1904. 4 days later, at Oviambo, the Herero ambushed the Germans from concealed positions, unleashing chaos. Disoriented and under heavy fire, the Germans barely escaped disaster, saved only by nightfall. Following this, Lutwine ordered a retreat to Okahanja, but news of the defeat reached Berlin, where he was harshly criticized for withdrawing from a racially inferior enemy. As a result, Lutwine was stripped of his military duties and replaced by General Lothar von Trotha, a ruthless veteran of Germany's brutal campaigns in East Africa. Known for his extreme methods, other colonial leaders had opposed Trotha's appointment. But despite this, the general was given full authority to lead the campaign against the Herero, overseeing both military and civilian affairs in the colony. Seeing the Hereros as unmentioned non-humans, von Trotha's goal was nothing short of their total extermination. With reinforcements arriving almost weekly, he prepared a plan for a final decisive blow against the Herero. His strategy was to encircle the natives at the Waterberg Plateau in north-central Heroland, where tens of thousands of Herero had gathered with their cattle. In the early hours of August 10, 1904, von Trotha launched his assault on the Herero at the Waterberg Plateau. With about 6,000 soldiers, he issued orders for his units to surround the natives and annihilate them. Most of the Hereros were asleep in their traditional huts when the bombardment started, and although they launched several counterattacks, they were eventually overwhelmed by the Germans' superior firepower. They eventually managed to break through the German lines on the southeastern side and fled into the Omaheke Desert, where their suffering would only worsen. For von Trotha, the battle at Waterberg marked the beginning of his genocidal campaign. He subsequently ordered all waterholes in the desert to be blocked, with German patrols stationed to prevent any hero from returning. Without access to water, thousands of Herero began to die of thirst in the desert. At dawn on October 3, 1904, General von Trotha issued the Vernichtungsbefehl Declaration, the extermination order. In a crude form of pidgin, he declared, "I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. The Hereros are no longer German subjects. They have murdered and stolen. They have cut off the ears and noses and other parts of the bodies of wounded soldiers, and now, out of cowardice, they no longer wish to fight. I say to the people, whoever delivers one of the chiefs to one of our stations as a prisoner will receive 1,000 marks. Whoever delivers Samuel Maherero will receive 5,000 marks. The Herero people must, however, leave the land. If they do not do this, I shall force them with a cannon. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I shall no longer receive any women or children. I shall drive them back to their people, or I shall order shots to be fired at them. This is my decision for the Herero people." To punctuate his words, 2 Herero men, captured alongside 35 others, were dragged to a makeshift gallows and executed in front of the German troops. The proclamation marked the beginning of one of the first genocidal campaigns of the 20th century. Following this, von Trotha organized the Aufklärungspatrouillen, or cleansing patrols, with the mission to sweep across Heroland and clean up the entire district of broken groups of Herero. There were still thousands of Herero in Heroland at the time, many of whom had not participated in the rebellion. These Herero, numbering between 20,000 and 30,000, were spread across a vast area, often in the remote northern and western parts of the colony, far from European settlements. Von Trode's orders were explicit. These people were to be shot on sight. There would be no differentiation between combatants and civilians, and no room for negotiation. The extermination continued until November 1904, when disease began to weaken the German patrols. Furthermore, German Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow, concerned about Germany's international reputation after previous colonial atrocities in East Africa and China, was alarmed by the extermination order. Fearing a massive diplomatic scandal if it became public, he insisted on its withdrawal, much to von Trode's disgust. Meanwhile, Kaiser Wilhelm II had secretly commissioned Count Georg von Stilfried to assess the situation. Stilfried, an officer in von Trode's army, recommended a shift in strategy. Instead of extermination, the surviving Herero should be disarmed and forced into concentration camps to serve as cheap labor. This plan was accepted. Soon the survivors were forced into concentration camps across the colony, with the largest in Windhoek and others in towns like Okahanja, Swakopmund, and Lüderitz. These camps were hastily constructed, with prisoners enduring horrific conditions. In Swakopmund, for example, detainees were confined behind barbed wire in flimsy shelters made from planks and sacks. They were crammed together, 30 to 50 people, regardless of age or gender, and subjected to grueling labor under harsh overseers with inadequate food and clothing. Disease spread rapidly, with about 40% of prisoners dying within their first 4 months. Despite attempts by some missionaries to bring attention to the horrific conditions, the German authorities remained steadfast in their belief that the Herero population was expendable. For them, the concentration camps were not merely for controlling the Herero, but were designed to eradicate them, leaving only a small, weakened population to serve as labor for the expanding German community. Peace will spell death for me and my nation, for I know that there is no place for me in your midst. By October 1904, Hendrik Witbooi, the revered leader of the Witbooi Nama, deeply troubled by the reports of the Waterberg massacre and the broader genocidal campaign, resolved to resist the Germans. Von Trotha had made it clear that the Nama would be next once the Hereros were subdued. Just a day before he issued his infamous extermination order on the 2nd of October, Witbooi sent out a series of letters to other Nama leaders calling for united uprising against the Germans. He managed to rally support, and within a month the Namas declared war on the Germans. Using guerrilla tactics, they ambushed the German forces, exhausting their resources. Meanwhile, Jacob Marina, another prominent Nama leader, had been conducting his own guerrilla campaign since October 1903. Nicknamed the Black Napoleon, his ability to sustain and expand his forces through successful raids and strategic withdrawals made him a formidable opponent. As the war progressed, the Germans continued to face mounting difficulties. As a result, in October 1905, General von Trotha, beleaguered and facing personal losses, requested to be relieved of his command. His request was granted. On his return to Germany, he was awarded the highest military order of the day and thanked wholeheartedly by the Kaiser for his loyal service. Around the same time, Captain Hendrik Witbooi, leading an attack on a German convoy, was struck in the thigh by a shard of shrapnel. He died 3 days later at the age of 75. With his death came the slow disintegration of the Nama alliance. Leadership was passed to Hendrik's eldest son, Isaac Witbooi, who, alongside other younger warriors like Marina and Cornelius Fredericks, continued to fight. However, many of the older leaders, including Samuel Isaac, favored negotiation. Eventually, on November 20th, 1905, Samuel Isaac and his followers surrendered to the Germans, marking a significant turning point in the war. I am not prepared to accept the responsibility for their deaths, since they were brought here in contravention of the promise I gave them in Gibeon in 1905, with the explicit support of the command. The next colonial governor of Southwest Africa was Friedrich von Lindequist. He oversaw economic development, expanded lands for German settlers, and continued the violent policies of his predecessors. Upon taking power, von Lindequist quickly dismantled the fragile peace with the Nama. He used the Witbooi surrender to pressure other Nama factions into submission, promising leniency and freedom. In early 1906, thousands of Nama, including the remaining Witbooi, persuaded by Samuel Isaac's surrender and reports of fair treatment, were marched to Windhoek, unaware they were being sent to concentration camps, joining thousands of Herero prisoners in horrific conditions. The Nama prisoners were specifically sent to Shark Island, the deadliest concentration camp in Southwest Africa. Under terrible conditions, disease spread rapidly, with 15 to 20 prisoners dying each week. Out of the estimated 2,400 Nama imprisoned in Shark Island, only 500 survived when the camp was closed in April 1907. Among them were Samuel Isaac and his family. The German administration would go on to seize all Herero and Nama lands, dividing them into farm plots for the settlers. By the early 1910s, the colony experienced an economic boom with the discovery of diamonds. However, this economic prosperity was short-lived as the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 dramatically altered the colony's fortunes. German Southwest Africa became a battleground as the Allied powers sought to dismantle Germany's global empire. British and South African forces invaded, aiming to seize control of the strategic territory and its valuable resources. By mid-1915, German Southwest Africa had fallen to the South Africans. While diamonds continued to be mined under the new administration, The wealth generated from these resources flowed into the hands of the new rulers, leaving the indigenous Herero and Nama populations further dispossessed. Samuel Maherero, the Herero leader, managed to escape with a group of survivors into British-controlled Bechuanaland, now Botswana, following the extermination order. He lived the rest of his life in exile, passing away in Bechuanaland in 1923. His body was later returned to Southwest Africa and buried in Okahanja, where annual commemorations, known as Herero Day, are still held in his honor. Jacob Marina, on the other hand, met his end in September 1907 when South African soldiers, collaborating with German forces, ambushed and killed him in the Cape Colony. His death marked the end of the Nama resistance. The Namibian genocide stands as one of the first genocides of the 20th century. It was a systematic attempt by the German colonial regime to annihilate the Herero and Nama peoples, along with other smaller African tribes, as punishment for their resistance to colonial rule. It is estimated that up to 80,000 Herero, around 80% of their entire population, were wiped out. The Nama lost approximately 10,000 people, which represented about 50% of their population. Smaller groups such as the Damara and San also faced significant losses, though their numbers are less well documented. In October 2007, the Trotha family, descendants of General Lothar von Trotha, visited Namibia at the invitation of Herero chiefs and publicly apologized for their relatives' actions. Initially, Germany resisted calling the events a genocide, arguing that the term was not established in international law until 1945. However, on May 28, 2021, Germany formally recognized the atrocities as genocide. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas publicly apologized and committed €1.1 billion in aid to the affected communities. Despite this, many Namibians criticized the agreement, arguing that Germany should return ancestral lands to the Herero and Nama rather than just provide financial aid. The road to reconciliation remains a complex one.